Rain hammered the windows of the diner so hard that Elena Marsh almost missed the small shadow standing just beyond the glass. She looked up from wiping down the counter and saw him again. The same boy who had been coming every evening for the past week, standing in the downpour without a coat, without an umbrella, without anyone beside him. He never came inside, he only watched. Elena set down her cloth and walked to the door before she could talk herself out of it. The bell above the frame rang sharply as she pushed it open, and cold air rushed in around her ankles. "You'll catch a fever standing out here," she called. "Come in before you turn to ice." The boy didn't move at first. His eyes, dark and unusually alert for a child who looked no older than 10, studied her the way a stray dog studies a hand it doesn't trust yet. Elena had seen that look before, in shelters, in the eyes of people who had learned the hard way that kindness often came with a price attached. "I don't have money," he said. His voice was steady, older than his years. "I didn't ask for any." Elena held the door wider. "Come on, it's warm in here, and I made too much stew tonight. Somebody has to eat it before it goes to waste." For a long moment, the boy simply stood there, rain running down his face, deciding something Elena couldn't guess at. Then, slowly, he stepped past her into the light. The diner was small, only 8 tables and a counter with 6 stools, tucked on the last street of Ashford Hollow before the road gave way to dense forest. Elena had inherited the place from her aunt 3 years ago, and though business was never grand, it was steady enough to keep the lights on and the coffee pot full. Tonight, with the storm keeping most customers away, the boy had the whole dining room practically to himself. She led him to a booth near the kitchen, away from the drafty windows, and disappeared behind the counter without asking further questions. She had learned long ago that some people needed food before they needed conversation. She ladled a generous bowl of beef stew, cut 2 thick slices of bread, and poured a tall glass of milk, setting it all before him with the same casual ease she might show any regular customer. "Eat," she said simply. "Talk only if you want to." The boy hesitated, staring at the bowl as though it might vanish if he reached for it too quickly. Then hunger won over caution, and he began to eat with a speed that told Elena everything she needed to know about how long it had been since his last real meal. She busied herself wiping down tables that were already clean, giving him the privacy to eat without being watched, though she kept careful sideways glances on him the whole time. When he finally slowed down, scraping the last of the stew from the bowl, she brought over a slice of apple pie without being asked, and set it in front of him. "On the house," she said before he could protest. "Pie's better with a name attached to it, though. What should I call you?" The boy considered this for a long moment, as if even his name were something dangerous to give away. "Kian," he said finally. "Just Kian?" "Just Kian." Elena smiled and did not push further. "Well, Kian, I'm Elena. This is my diner. You're welcome here anytime, rain or shine, money or no money." Something flickered across the boy's face, something like disbelief mixed with a longing so deep it made Elena's chest ache. He said nothing more, only finished his pie in smaller, more thoughtful bites, and when he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said quietly, and then he was gone, swallowed by the rain and the dark tree line beyond the last streetlight. Elena watched him go until she couldn't see him anymore, then turned back to closing up for the night, her mind lingering on the boy far longer than she expected. There had been something about him that didn't fit the ordinary picture of a hungry child. It wasn't just the hunger in his eyes. It was the alertness, the way he had positioned himself near the door the entire meal, the way his gaze had swept the room twice before he ever took a bite, as though checking for threats a normal child would never think to look for. She told herself it was none of her business. Ashford Hollow was a strange town in its own quiet way, tucked at the edge of a forest that locals rarely spoke of directly, and children who wandered in from difficult homes were not unheard of. She had fed hungry travelers before. This was no different. Except it was. The next evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, Elena found herself glancing toward the window more often than usual, wiping the same table twice, refilling salt shakers that didn't need refilling. When the door finally opened and the little bell rang, she felt an unexpected rush of relief seeing Kian step inside on his own, without needing an invitation this time. He wore the same thin jacket as the night before, though it had dried since then, and his hair was neatly combed in a way that suggested someone, somewhere, was still trying to take care of him properly, even if that care clearly had limits. He slid into the same booth as before, as though it had already become his spot. "Hungry again?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. Kian nodded, and this time there was the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. The stew was good. "I'll make you something even better tonight," She winked and disappeared into the kitchen, humming softly as she worked, unable to shake the small, warm feeling that had settled in her chest at the sight of him walking in like it was the most natural thing in the world. This time, she brought him roasted chicken with vegetables, along with a warm roll slathered in butter. She sat across from him while he ate, not hovering, not asking too many questions, just present in a way that seemed to put him at ease. "You come from around here?" she asked eventually, keeping her tone light, conversational, the kind of question anyone might ask a new customer. Kian's fork paused over his plate for just a heartbeat before he answered, "Kind of." "Kind of," Elena repeated with a small laugh. "That's a very careful answer for such a simple question." "I'm a careful person," Kian said, and something about the seriousness in his voice, so mismatched with his small frame, made Elena's smile falter just slightly. "Careful is good," she said instead of pressing further. "Careful keeps people safe." Kian looked up at her then, really looked, as though weighing whether she meant those words or was simply filling silence the way adults often did. Whatever he found in her expression seemed to satisfy him, because he returned to his meal with a little more ease in his shoulders. Over the following days, Kian became a fixture at the diner. He arrived just as the sun began its descent, always alone, always quiet at first, warming slowly into brief conversations as the meal progressed. Elena learned small things about him in careful, cautious fragments. He liked stories about the ocean, though he had never seen it. He was curious about how the diner's old jukebox worked, spending long minutes just watching the records spin. He never mentioned parents. He never mentioned where he slept, or who tucked him in at night, or whether anyone worried when he wasn't home. Elena noticed other things too, things she couldn't quite explain away. There was a fading bruise along his forearm one evening, which he covered quickly with his sleeve when he caught her looking, offering no explanation and clearly expecting none of her questions. His hearing seemed unnervingly sharp, his head turning toward sounds from the kitchen or the street, long before Elena herself noticed anything at all. And more than once, she caught him staring out toward the dark edge of the forest that bordered the town, his expression tightening into something that looked almost like fear, or perhaps longing, she couldn't quite decide which. She thought about calling someone, a school counselor perhaps, or the local sheriff, just to make sure a hungry, wandering child wasn't slipping through cracks that shouldn't exist in a town as small as Ashford Hollow. But every time she considered it, she remembered the way Kian's shoulders had gone rigid the one time she'd casually mentioned the word authorities in an unrelated sentence about permits for the diner. His reaction had been so immediate, so sharp, that she'd dropped the subject entirely and never brought up anything resembling officials again. Instead, she chose patience. She continued feeding him, continued offering warmth without demanding answers in return, trusting that whatever walls he had built around himself would come down in their own time, if she simply gave him the space to lower them himself. One particular evening, nearly 2 weeks after that first rainy night, Kian arrived later than usual, well after dark had fully settled over the town. His steps seemed heavier, his eyes more tired, and when Elena set his usual plate in front of him, he didn't dive into it with his customary hunger. He simply stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "Do you ever get scared?" he asked quietly, not looking up. The question caught Elena off guard, but she answered honestly, "Sometimes. Everyone does." "What do you do when you're scared?" Elena considered this carefully, sensing the weight behind such a simple question from such a small boy. "I remind myself that being scared doesn't mean something bad is definitely going to happen, and I try to find someone I trust to stand beside me until the fear passes." Kian was quiet for a long moment, turning his fork over in his fingers without eating. "What if there's nobody like that?" "Then you find someone," Elena said gently, reaching across the table to give his hand a light, reassuring squeeze. "Even if it takes time, even if it's someone you didn't expect." He looked up at her then, and for just a moment, something in his carefully guarded expression cracked open, revealing a depth of loneliness that made Elena's throat tighten. She didn't ask what had frightened him that particular night, sensing instinctively that pushing would only close the door she had worked so hard to keep open. Instead, she simply stayed there with him, letting the silence between them be a comfort rather than a void, until eventually he picked up his fork and began to eat. When he finally left that night, later than usual, disappearing once again into the darkness toward the tree line, Elena stood at the window long after he vanished from sight, an uneasy feeling settling deep in her stomach. Something was happening in that boy's life, something far beyond ordinary hardship, and though she couldn't yet name what it was, she felt with growing certainty that whatever secrets Kian carried were far larger and far more dangerous than a simple story of a hungry child wandering into a diner. She locked the door that night, but she left the porch light burning, just in case he needed to find his way back sooner than expected. It became a habit she would keep every single night from then on, a small beacon glowing at the edge of the forest, a silent promise that no matter what waited for him out there in the dark, there would always be a warm plate and an open door waiting for him at her diner. A scream tore through the night, sharp and sudden, and Elena's hand froze halfway to flipping the sign on her door to closed. It came from somewhere near the tree line, distant but unmistakable, and every instinct in her body told her it belonged to a child. She dropped her keys and ran. The gravel path behind the diner led toward the edge of the forest, and Elena's flashlight beam bounced wildly across roots and fallen branches as she pushed forward, calling Kian's name into the darkness. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had never gone this far past her own property line before, had never dared step foot near the woods that the townsfolk spoke of only in hushed, uneasy tones. "Kian!" she shouted again, her voice cracking with worry. Silence answered her, thick and unnatural, the kind of silence that seemed to swallow sound rather than simply lack it. Even the crickets, which usually filled the night with constant noise, had gone completely still. Elena pressed forward anyway, refusing to turn back despite every nerve in her body screaming that something was deeply wrong with these woods. It had been 3 days since Kian had shown up at her diner. 3 days of Elena standing at her window each evening, watching the empty road, the porch light burning uselessly against a night that refused to bring him back. She had told herself he was simply busy, perhaps sick, perhaps staying somewhere warm for a change. But tonight, walking home later than usual after restocking supplies, she had heard that scream, and something deep in her gut told her it belonged to the boy she had grown to care for, far more than she probably should have in such a short time. The forest floor sloped downward, and Elena stumbled over a thick root, catching herself against a tree trunk just before she would have fallen. Her flashlight beam swept across the darkness ahead, and that was when she saw it. A tall fence, half hidden by overgrown brush, stretching in both directions as far as her light could reach. It looked nothing like the simple wooden fences that marked property lines around Ashford Hollow. This one was solid, reinforced, clearly built to keep something either in or out. She approached cautiously, running her fingers along the cold metal, searching for a gate or an opening. She found one a few dozen feet further along, a heavy gate slightly ajar, as though someone had passed through it recently and hadn't bothered to secure it properly behind them. Every rational thought told Elena to turn back, to call the sheriff, to let someone with actual authority handle whatever lay beyond that fence. But the memory of Kian's frightened eyes, the fading bruises on his arm, the way he had asked her what to do when scared, pushed her forward instead. She slipped through the gap in the gate and continued into the darkness beyond. The trees here were older, denser, blocking out even the faint moonlight that had guided her path before. Elena kept her flashlight low, some instinct telling her that a bright beam might draw unwanted attention rather than help her find her way. She moved as quietly as she could manage, her footsteps still far too loud against the thick carpet of fallen leaves. Then, ahead of her, she saw lights, not natural moonlight, but the warm glow of electric lamps, strung along a path that led toward what appeared to be a large compound nestled deep within the trees. Elena crouched low behind a fallen log, staring in disbelief at the scene before her. The compound was enormous, far larger than anything she would have expected hidden within an ordinary forest. Sturdy wooden buildings, connected by covered walkways, spread across a cleared section of land, and figures moved between them with a discipline and alertness that reminded her uncomfortably of a military base, rather than any kind of ordinary home. Several men stood at intervals along the perimeter, still and watchful, clearly serving as guards though she saw no weapons in their hands. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the scene, searching for any sign of Kian among the figures moving below. She didn't find him, but she did notice something else deeply unsettling. Every single person she could see moved with an unnatural grace, a fluid precision to their steps that felt more animal than human, and more than once, she caught the glint of eyes reflecting light in a way that human eyes simply did not. A twig snapped beneath her foot as she shifted position, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence of the forest. Before she could even process what had happened, two of the guards below turned their heads sharply in her direction, their movements far too fast, far too precise for ordinary men reacting to an ordinary noise. Elena barely had time to gasp before strong hands seized her from behind, hauling her upright with a grip that left no room for struggle. She was spun around to face a man she hadn't even heard approaching, his expression carved from stone, his eyes sharp and assessing in a way that made her skin prickle with fear. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice low and controlled, though there was an edge beneath it that promised very little patience. And why are you trespassing on private land? I heard a scream, Elena managed, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. A child's scream. I was looking for a boy named Kian. I only wanted to make sure he was safe. Something shifted in the man's expression at the mention of the name. A flicker of surprise quickly smoothed back into careful neutrality. He exchanged a glance with the second guard, some unspoken communication passing between them that Elena couldn't decipher. You know the young master, the man said slowly, as though testing the truth of her words. The young master, Elena repeated, confusion tightening her voice. He's just a boy. He comes to my diner. I feed him. That's all. The two guards exchanged another glance, longer this time, before the first man's grip on her arm tightened, guiding her firmly forward despite her attempts to plant her feet. You'll need to explain that to someone with more authority than us, he said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. Come with us, quietly, and nothing will happen to you. Elena's mind raced as she was led down the path toward the compound, past buildings that hummed with quiet, controlled activity, past more of those strange, alert figures who paused their tasks to watch her passing with unreadable expressions. She tried to catch a glimpse of anything familiar, any sign that Kian might be nearby, but the compound sprawled far larger than she had initially estimated from her hiding spot, and she quickly lost any sense of direction within its winding paths. They led her to the largest building at the center of the compound, a structure built from dark timber and stone that radiated an authority Elena couldn't quite explain, as though the building itself understood its own importance. Heavy doors swung open before they even reached them, revealing a spacious hall lit by warm lantern light, its walls lined with framed portraits of solemn men and women, whose eyes seemed to follow Elena as she was marched inside. At the far end of the hall, seated in a chair that resembled a throne more than ordinary furniture, was a man whose presence alone seemed to fill the entire room with a tension Elena had never experienced before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply but with an unmistakable air of command, and his eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, held a coldness that made her instinctively want to shrink backward. We found her near the eastern fence line, the guard holding her arm reported. She claims to know the young master, says she heard him scream. The seated man's gaze sharpened immediately at those words, his posture straightening with an intensity that filled the room like an electric charge. Kian, he said, his voice a low, controlled growl that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have. You know my son? Elena's mind reeled, trying to process the sudden weight of that single word. Son, this intimidating, powerful man, radiating an authority that seemed to command the very air around him, was Kian's father. I run a diner in town, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the fear clawing at her chest. Kian has been coming there for weeks. I feed him. I never knew who he was. I only wanted to make sure he was safe when I heard him scream tonight. The man studied her for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable, calculating in a way that made Elena feel as though every secret she had ever kept was somehow visible to him. Then he rose from his seat, and even that simple motion carried a weight of authority that made every guard in the room straighten instinctively. You have been feeding my son, he said slowly, each word deliberate, without my knowledge, for weeks. It wasn't quite a question, but Elena answered anyway. Yes, he was hungry. I didn't ask why. I only wanted to help him. For a long, tense moment, nobody in the room moved. Elena held her breath, uncertain whether she had just committed some grave offense in a world she didn't understand, or whether her honesty might somehow be enough to see her safely out of this strange, unsettling place. The man's dark eyes bore into hers with an intensity that felt like being studied by something far more perceptive than an ordinary person, something that seemed to see straight through every attempt at composure she tried to maintain. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer now, though no less commanding. Where is my son now? I don't know, Elena admitted, her voice tightening with genuine worry. He hasn't come to my diner in 3 days. Tonight I heard a scream from these woods, and I feared the worst. That's why I came looking. The man's jaw tightened, and he turned sharply toward one of his guards, issuing a rapid string of commands Elena couldn't fully follow. Something about search patterns and the northern ridge and reporting back within the hour. Guards scattered instantly, moving with that same unnatural speed and precision she had noticed earlier, leaving Elena standing alone in the vast hall with the imposing man now stalking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. You will remain here, he said, until my son is found safe. Then, you and I will have a much longer conversation about exactly what you know, and exactly why my son has apparently chosen a stranger's diner over his own home these past weeks. Elena swallowed hard. fear and determination warring within her chest in equal measure. Whatever this place was, whoever this man truly was, one thing had become abundantly clear in these last terrifying minutes. Kian's life was far more complicated and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined from the quiet, hungry boy who had first stepped through her diner's door. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she was tangled directly into the center of it. The doors of the hall burst open before Elena could ask another question, and a young guard rushed in, breathless, his face pale beneath the lantern light. "Alpha Damien," he said quickly, addressing the powerful man who had been questioning Elena moments before. "We found tracks near the northern ridge, but the young master isn't there. We believe he crossed into contested territory." The change that came over Damien's face was immediate and terrifying. His entire body seemed to tense, his eyes flashing with something that looked almost golden in the lantern light, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest that made every hair on Elena's arms stand on end. "Contested territory," Damien repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "How long ago?" "The tracks are perhaps 2 hours old," the guard answered, clearly struggling to remain composed under his leader's intensity. "We're mobilizing a search party immediately." Elena's stomach twisted into a knot of dread. She didn't fully understand what contested territory meant, but the sheer panic rippling through the room told her it wasn't anywhere safe for a young boy to wander alone. "Take 20 men," Damien commanded. "I want eyes on every inch of that border before dawn. If anyone from the Hollowfang pack has laid a single hand on my son, I want to know before I arrive, not after." The guard nodded sharply and disappeared just as quickly as he had come, and Damien turned back toward Elena, his expression a complicated mixture of barely controlled fury and something that looked disturbingly close to fear, an emotion Elena suspected this powerful man rarely allowed himself to feel, let alone show. "You said he hasn't visited your diner in 3 days, Damien said, his voice tight. "Think carefully. Did he say anything unusual before he stopped coming? Anything at all that might explain why he would risk crossing into dangerous territory alone?" Elena's mind raced backward through their conversations, searching for anything she might have overlooked. "He asked me what to do when scared," she said slowly. "He seemed troubled that night, more than usual. He asked if I ever got scared, and what I did about it." Damien's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering beneath his skin. "He's been training harder than any child his age should have to," he said, more to himself than to Elena, his voice quieter now, almost regretful. "I pushed him. I thought preparing him early would keep him safe. I never considered he might run from the pressure rather than toward it." There was a rawness in his voice that surprised Elena, a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the intimidating exterior that made her see him, for just a moment, not as some terrifying figure of authority but as a father genuinely terrified for his child's safety. "I need to help find him," Elena said suddenly, surprising even herself with the conviction in her voice. Damien's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and assessing. "This is not a place for someone like you. You have no understanding of the dangers that exist beyond that fence line." "Neither does Kian, apparently," Elena shot back, refusing to back down despite the way his gaze seemed to bore straight through her. "But he trusts me. If he's scared and hiding somewhere, he might respond to a familiar voice faster than an army of strangers searching for him." For a long moment, Damien studied her with an intensity that made Elena feel as though every thought in her mind was somehow visible to him. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he finally gave a single, sharp nod. "You will stay close to me," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You do exactly as I say, when I say it. Is that understood?" "Understood," Elena agreed immediately, relief and terror mixing together in her chest. Damien turned and strode toward the doors, moving with a speed and purpose that had Elena nearly jogging to keep pace beside him. Outside, the compound had transformed entirely from the quiet, disciplined scene Elena had witnessed earlier. Now it buzzed with barely contained urgency, guards moving in organized groups, checking equipment, exchanging terse instructions, every face etched with the same grim determination that radiated from their leader. A woman approached them as they crossed the central courtyard, her expression tight with worry, her eyes flicking curiously toward Elena before returning to Damien. "Alpha, the search parties are ready to move," she reported. "Should I coordinate with the Eastern Division as well?" "Yes, Nora. Have them sweep the ravine trail," Damien instructed, "and send word to the healer to prepare, just in case." Nora nodded and hurried off, and Elena found herself struggling to process the scale of the operation unfolding around her, all mobilized within minutes for the sake of one missing boy. Whatever world she had stumbled into, it was clear that Kian's safety mattered here, with an intensity that went far beyond ordinary parental concern. They reached the edge of the compound where a group of 6 guards waited, already equipped with lanterns and rope, their postures alert and ready. Damien addressed them briefly, outlining a search grid that would cover the disputed border territory, before gesturing for Elena to follow him toward the tree line. The forest beyond the compound's boundary felt different immediately, darker somehow, the air thick with a tension that made the fine hairs on Elena's neck rise instinctively. She stayed close to Damien as instructed, her flashlight beam sweeping across roots and underbrush, searching for any sign of a small boy's passage through this unforgiving terrain. "How long has Kian lived without a mother?" Elena asked quietly, unable to stop herself from wondering about the boy's life before he ever appeared at her diner window. Damien's steps faltered slightly before continuing. 3 years, he said, his voice carefully controlled. "She was taken from us in a conflict with a rival pack. Kian was young, but old enough to remember losing her. I have tried to protect him ever since, perhaps too fiercely. I see now that fierce protection can feel like a prison to a child who simply wants to be a child." Elena said nothing, sensing the weight behind his words, the guilt he was clearly wrestling with as they pushed deeper into the darkness together. They walked for what felt like an hour, following faint markers that Damien seemed to read from the terrain itself, subtle signs Elena couldn't begin to interpret. Occasionally they would pause while Damien tilted his head, listening intently to sounds Elena couldn't hear at all, before continuing onward with renewed determination. Finally, as they crested a small ridge overlooking a shallow ravine, Damien suddenly went rigid, his entire body freezing mid-step. "There," he whispered, pointing toward a cluster of boulders near the ravine's edge. "I hear breathing. Small. Frightened." Elena's heart leapt into her throat, and she moved forward before she could stop herself, ignoring Damien's low warning to proceed carefully. She scrambled down the slope, her flashlight beam catching a small huddled shape pressed tightly against the base of the largest boulder, arms wrapped around his knees, shivering uncontrollably. "Kian," Elena called out, relief flooding through her so intensely that her legs nearly gave way beneath her. The boy's head snapped up, his eyes wide and glassy with exhaustion and fear, and for a moment he simply stared at her, as though unable to believe she was truly there. Then his face crumpled, and he scrambled forward, throwing himself into her arms with a desperate sob that broke something deep inside Elena's chest. "I'm sorry," he choked out against her shoulder. "I didn't mean to run this far. I just wanted to be somewhere nobody expected anything from me. I got lost, and then I heard growling, and I hid, and I didn't know how to find my way back." "You're safe now," Elena murmured, holding him tightly, smoothing a hand over his tangled hair. "You're safe, I promise." Damien arrived moments later, dropping to his knees beside them, his controlled composure completely shattered, as he reached out to grip his son's shoulder, checking him over with frantic, careful hands for any sign of injury. "Kian," he said, his voice thick with an emotion Elena hadn't expected from someone so powerful and controlled. "Never again. Do you understand me? Never disappear like that again." "I'm sorry, Father," Kian whispered, still clinging tightly to Elena even as he addressed Damien. "I just needed to breathe." Everything felt too heavy. Damien's expression softened into something raw and vulnerable, and he reached out to pull his son gently away from Elena, wrapping him instead into his own arms, holding him with a fierce tenderness that seemed entirely at odds with the intimidating figure Elena had first encountered in that great hall. "We will talk about heavy things," Damien murmured against his son's hair. "Together, from now on, I promise you that." Elena watched the two of them, father and son, reunited in the darkness of the forest, and felt tears prick unexpectedly at her own eyes. Whatever complicated, dangerous world she had stumbled into tonight, one thing had become entirely clear. This small, frightened boy meant everything to the powerful man kneeling beside him, and somehow, through nothing more than a simple bowl of stew offered on a rainy night, Elena had become a part of that fragile, precious bond. As they made their way back toward the compound, Kian walking safely between them, his small hand slipped quietly into Elena's, and she held it firmly, unwilling to let go, unaware of just how deeply her life was about to change because of this one small act of kindness. Morning light filtered weakly through the tall windows of the great hall as Elena sat stiffly on a wooden bench, waiting for whatever conversation Damien had promised would follow the previous night's terrifying search. Kian slept soundly in a nearby room under the watchful eye of an elderly healer named Ruth, finally safe and warm after his ordeal in the ravine, and Elena found herself both exhausted and strangely reluctant to leave until she knew for certain the boy would be all right. Damien entered the hall looking equally worn, dark circles shadowing his eyes, though his posture remained as commanding as ever. He crossed the room and settled into the chair across from her rather than the imposing seat at the head of the hall, a small gesture that Elena noticed and appreciated more than she expected to. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words seeming to cost him something significant. "For finding him. For calling out to him when I might have simply searched in silence forever. He's a good boy," Elena said simply. "He deserves to know someone is always looking for him. In every sense of those words." Damien studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his tired eyes. "May I ask you something directly, Elena Marsh?" She nodded, curious despite the exhaustion pulling at her own limbs. "Why did you keep feeding him, a stranger's child, appearing at your window night after night, offering nothing in return? Most people would have called the authorities within the first week, assuming there even are authorities equipped to handle a matter like this." Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "Because he was hungry, and I had food. It never felt complicated to me. I didn't need to know who he was or where he came from, to know that a child standing alone in the rain deserved a warm meal and a safe place to eat it." Such simple kindness, Damien murmured, almost to himself, and yet it managed to reach him in ways my entire compound, with all its resources and protection, apparently could not. "He was lonely," Elena said gently. "Sometimes loneliness needs a different kind of medicine than safety alone can provide." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window where morning light continued to strengthen across the courtyard beyond. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of decision already made. "I would like you to continue caring for Kian," he said. "Not merely at your diner, though he is welcome to keep visiting if that brings him comfort, but here as well. He needs consistency, warmth. Someone who sees him simply as a boy, rather than as an heir, carrying the weight of an entire pack's future. I believe you could provide that in ways my guards and even I, admittedly, have struggled to offer." Elena blinked, surprised by the sudden proposal. "I run a diner. I have no experience with whatever world this is, whatever you and your people truly are." "You don't need experience with our world," Damien said. "You need only continue doing exactly what you've already been doing. Kindness, consistency, honesty. Those qualities matter here just as much as they do beyond that fence." Elena hesitated, weighing the strangeness of the request against the image of Kian's tear-streaked face pressed against her shoulder the night before, the desperate way he had clung to her as though she represented something essential he had been missing his entire life. "What exactly are you?" she asked finally, deciding that if she was going to consider this arrangement seriously, she deserved honest answers first. "The guards, the way they move, the strength in your voice last night that made grown men flinch. I've never seen anything like it." Damien's expression grew serious, and for a moment Elena wondered if she had overstepped some unspoken boundary. But then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, and began to explain. "My people are shifters," he said simply. "We carry the blood of wolves within us, capable of taking their form when necessary, though most of us live our lives primarily in human shape, especially those who interact regularly with the outside world as I sometimes must for trade and negotiation. Kian will develop this ability as he grows older, likely within the next year or two, and the transition can be frightening and difficult without proper guidance and support." Elena absorbed this information slowly, surprised to find that fear was not the dominant emotion rising within her. Instead, curiosity and a strange, settling sense of understanding took its place, as though pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even realized she'd been assembling were finally clicking into position. "That explains a great deal," she said eventually. "The way he watches doorways, the way his senses seem sharper than any ordinary child's." "He has been training since he could walk," Damien admitted, a flicker of regret crossing his features. "I lost his mother to violence from a rival pack, and in my grief, I became convinced that preparing him early, hardening him against the dangers of our world, would somehow protect him from suffering a similar fate. I see now, watching him run from that very training toward the comfort of your diner, that perhaps I have been protecting him from the wrong things entirely." "Grief makes people do strange things," Elena said softly, understanding the weight behind his confession more than she let on. "It convinces us that control is the same thing as safety, when really, sometimes safety looks a lot more like simply being present and listening." Damien's eyes lifted to meet hers, something shifting in his expression, an openness that hadn't been there during their tense confrontation the night before. "You speak as though you understand grief personally. I lost my aunt 3 years ago," Elena said. "She's the reason I have the diner at all. I understand what it's like to try controlling everything around you, because the one thing you couldn't control, losing someone, already happened once and you're terrified of it happening again." A long silence stretched between them, filled with an understanding that felt unexpectedly intimate given how recently they had met. Finally, Damien spoke again, his voice quieter, more vulnerable than Elena would have guessed possible from the commanding figure she'd first encountered. "Will you consider my proposal then? Kian needs you, in whatever form that guidance takes. And I confess, speaking with you these past few minutes has clarified more about my own mistakes than months of solitary reflection ever managed to accomplish." Elena thought of Kian's small hand slipped trustingly into hers the night before, of his desperate relief upon seeing her face in that dark ravine, of the months of quiet dinners that had built something precious between them, without either of them fully realizing it at the time. "I'll help," she said finally, "but I have conditions of my own." A ghost of a smile crossed Damien's tired features. "Name them." "I keep running my diner. Whatever arrangement we create, it happens around that, not instead of it. And you spend more time with Kian yourself, rather than assuming training alone will keep him safe. He needs his father as much as he needs anyone else in his life." Damien nodded slowly, something like respect settling into his expression. "Agreed, on both counts." They shook hands then, a simple, formal gesture that felt entirely insufficient for the significance of what they had just decided together, and yet it marked the beginning of an arrangement that would soon reshape both of their lives in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated in that quiet morning hall. As if summoned by their agreement, the door to the healer's room opened, and Kian emerged, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, his gaze immediately searching the hall until it landed on Elena. His face broke into a smile so genuine, so relieved, that Elena felt her heart swell with a warmth that erased any lingering doubts about the strange new arrangement she had just accepted. "You're still here," he said, hurrying across the room toward her. "I'm still here," Elena confirmed, opening her arms to receive him as he crashed into her in an enthusiastic hug. "And I'm going to keep being here, if that's all right with you." Kian pulled back, glancing between Elena and his father with a dawning understanding, and hope so bright it nearly brought tears to Elena's eyes. "Really? You're not just visiting?" "Really," Damien confirmed, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Elena has agreed to help take care of you, alongside me. We're going to do things differently from now on, Kian. Together." Kian looked between the two adults with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that only a child who had been carrying far too heavy a burden could truly understand, and in that moment, watching his relief blossom into genuine happiness, Elena knew without any doubt that she had made exactly the right decision, regardless of how strange or complicated the world she was stepping into might prove to be. A loud crash from the kitchen sent Elena rushing through the swinging doors, her heart hammering, only to find Kian standing amid a scattered pile of pots and pans, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment rather than danger. "I was trying to reach the big pot," he explained sheepishly, gesturing toward the top shelf. "I wanted to surprise you by making the stew myself before you got here." Elena couldn't help but laugh, the tension draining from her shoulders as she knelt to help him gather the fallen cookware. 3 weeks had passed since her agreement with Damien, and this scene had become achingly familiar. Kian arriving at the diner earlier now, no longer sneaking through rain and darkness but walking openly alongside one of his father's guards, spending afternoons helping Elena prep for the dinner rush before returning to the compound each evening for his training sessions, now conducted with far more patience and far less pressure than before. "Next time, ask for help reaching the top shelf," Elena said, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Surprises are lovely, but not the kind that come with bruised toes." "Deal," Kian agreed cheerfully, already moving to help her carry ingredients toward the stove. Their afternoons together had settled into a comfortable rhythm over these past weeks, filled with easy conversation and small domestic tasks that seemed to bring Kian more genuine peace than anything Elena imagined his rigorous training could offer. He told her about his lessons now, not just in guarded fragments but with growing openness, describing how his father had begun including him in strategy discussions rather than simply drilling him in physical exercises, how the harsh edges of his training schedule had softened considerably since that night in the ravine. Elena's visits to the compound had become similarly regular, though far less dramatic than her first terrifying encounter. She arrived most evenings after closing the diner, sharing dinner with Kian and often Damien as well, the three of them settling into an unexpectedly comfortable domestic scene despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding it. She had met more of the pack members during these visits, including Nora, the sharp, capable woman who managed much of the compound's daily operations, and a warm, elderly man named Peter, who served as one of Damien's most trusted advisors, and had taken quite a liking to Elena's cooking whenever she brought samples from the diner. Tonight, after finishing preparations at the diner, Elena made her way toward the compound as usual, the path through the forest now familiar enough that she no longer needed a flashlight to navigate its winding turns. She found Damien waiting near the edge of the courtyard, an unusual expression on his face that made her pause mid-stride. "Is something wrong?" she asked immediately, concern sharpening her voice. "No, nothing wrong," Damien said quickly, though the careful way he chose his next words suggested otherwise. "I simply wanted to speak with you before dinner. Would you walk with me?" Elena fell into step beside him as they moved along a quiet path bordering the compound's eastern edge, away from the usual bustle of evening activity. The forest here opened into a small clearing where wildflowers grew in scattered patches, illuminated by the soft golden light of the setting sun. "Kian told me something interesting today," Damien began, his tone careful, measured. "He said that watching us together, you and I, made him feel like our family finally had two parents again, rather than just one trying desperately hard to be enough." Elena's breath caught slightly at the weight behind those words. "Children notice more than we give them credit for." "They do," Damien agreed, stopping to face her directly, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. "And it forced me to examine something I have been avoiding acknowledging these past weeks, Elena. My growing feelings for you extend well beyond simple gratitude for the care you've shown my son." The words hung in the evening air between them, and Elena found herself momentarily unable to respond, her heart hammering with a mixture of surprise and something warmer, something she had been quietly noticing in herself as well, but hadn't dared examine too closely. "I felt it too," she admitted finally, the honesty coming easier than she expected. "These past weeks, watching you with Kian, seeing the way you've changed your approach with him, the patience you've shown, even when it clearly challenges everything your instincts tell you about protection and control. It's been impossible not to develop feelings alongside that admiration." Something in Damien's expression eased, a tension she hadn't fully registered until it dissolved, replaced by a warmth that transformed his usually stern features entirely. "I never expected to feel this way again," he said quietly. "After losing Kian's mother, I convinced myself that part of my life was finished, that my only remaining purpose was protecting our pack and raising our son as best I could manage alone. You've shown me that perhaps healing looks different than I assumed, that it doesn't require forgetting the past but rather building something new alongside it." "Grief and love aren't opposites," Elena said softly. "Sometimes the space grief leaves behind is exactly where new love finds room to grow, if we let it." Damien reached out slowly, giving her ample time to step away if she chose, before gently taking her hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a pleasant shiver through her, and she found herself leaning slightly into the contact rather than retreating from it. "I would like to court you properly," he said, a formality to his words that struck Elena as oddly endearing given the modern world she still belonged to beyond this hidden compound. "Not simply as Kian's caretaker, but as someone I hope might choose to build a life alongside both of us, if that is something you would want as well." Elena considered the magnitude of what he was asking, the strangeness of the world she would be stepping fully into, the responsibilities and dangers that undoubtedly accompanied a life bound to someone of Damien's position and power. But then she thought of Kian's bright smile that afternoon in her kitchen, of the quiet comfort of shared dinners in the great hall, of the unexpected tenderness she had witnessed growing between herself and this complicated, powerful man over these past weeks. "I would like that very much," she said, and the smile that broke across Damien's face in response was unlike anything she had seen from him before, unguarded and genuinely joyful in a way that made her chest ache with tenderness. They stood together in that quiet clearing as the last light of sunset faded into the soft blue of evening, hands intertwined, the beginning of something neither of them had expected but both had quietly hoped for, settling comfortably between them. When they finally returned to the compound for dinner, Kian took one look at their joined hands, and the soft smiles neither of them could quite suppress, and let out a whoop of delighted laughter that echoed cheerfully across the courtyard. "Finally," he declared dramatically, throwing his hands up in exaggerated relief that made both adults laugh despite themselves. "I thought I was going to have to lock you both in a room together until you figured it out." "Cheeky," Elena said, swatting playfully at his shoulder as they made their way toward the dining hall together, "considering how patient we've both had to be with your own dramatics these past weeks." Dinner that evening carried a lightness that Elena hadn't experienced since arriving at the compound weeks before, filled with easy laughter and comfortable conversation, Peter joining them partway through with stories that had Kian giggling uncontrollably, Nora stopping by briefly to share updates on compound business that Damien addressed with far more relaxed attention than his usual intense focus. As the evening wound down and Elena prepared to make her way back toward town, Damien walked her to the edge of the compound, the forest path stretching quiet and peaceful before them under a sky scattered with early stars. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving my family a chance to heal, in ways I never anticipated when Kian first began sneaking away to your diner." "Thank you for trusting me with something so precious," Elena replied, reaching up to press a gentle kiss to his cheek, before turning to walk the familiar path home, her heart lighter and fuller than it had felt in longer than she could easily remember. Behind her, she could hear Damien's soft laughter carrying on the evening breeze, a sound of genuine happiness that she suspected had been far too rare within these compound walls for far too long, and she smiled to herself, grateful beyond measure for the unexpected turn her simple act of kindness toward a hungry boy had taken. Nora burst into the diner without knocking, her chest heaving from a hard run through the forest, her usually composed expression shattered by open alarm. Elena, who had been wiping down the counter after closing, dropped her cloth immediately at the sight of her. "Elena, you need to come now," Nora said urgently. "There's been an incursion at the southern border. Damien needs to speak with you immediately." Elena's stomach dropped, months of comfortable routine shattering in an instant at the raw fear in Nora's voice. "Is Kian all right? Is Damien hurt?" "Everyone is safe for now," Nora said, though her tightly controlled tone suggested that safety might be a very temporary condition. "But we've received word that the Ashwood Pack has been probing our borders for weeks, testing our defenses. Tonight they made contact with one of our patrols. Damien believes they may be planning something larger." Elena grabbed her coat without hesitation, following Nora out into the cool night air, and along the now familiar path toward the compound. 6 months had passed since that evening in the clearing when Damien had asked to court her properly. 6 months that had transformed Elena's simple, quiet life into something rich and complicated, and deeply fulfilling despite the occasional undercurrents of danger she had gradually learned to accept as part of this world. She found Damien in the Great Hall, surrounded by his most trusted advisors, a large map spread across the central table marked with symbols Elena couldn't fully interpret. His expression, when he looked up and saw her entering, softened briefly with relief before hardening again into the fierce, commanding intensity that ruling his pack seemed to demand. "The Ashwood Pack has grown bold since their alpha died last winter," Damien explained without preamble, clearly wanting Elena informed rather than sheltered from the reality of the situation. His successor, a man named Victor Ashwood, has apparently decided that expanding his territory at our expense would establish his authority more quickly than the patient diplomacy his predecessor practiced. "What does that mean for us?" Elena asked, though dread already coiled tightly in her stomach. "It means we need to prepare for the possibility of direct conflict," Damien said grimly. "And it means you and Kian both need additional protection until this matter is resolved." As if summoned by his name, Kian appeared in the doorway, his young face pale with worry that seemed far too heavy for a boy his age to carry. "Father, is it true? Are we going to war?" Damien crossed the room swiftly, kneeling to meet his son's eyes directly. "I am doing everything within my power to prevent that outcome, Kian. But I need you to be extra cautious for the coming weeks. No wandering beyond the compound boundaries, not even to Elena's diner, until we understand exactly what Victor Ashwood intends." Kian nodded solemnly, though Elena could see the fear lurking behind his composed expression, the memory of losing his mother to pack violence clearly resurfacing at the mention of potential conflict. She moved to his side immediately, wrapping an arm around his shoulders in silent comfort. "Your father is very good at keeping people safe," she said gently. "And now he has even more people helping him than before. We're going to be all right." The following days brought a tense, watchful energy to the compound, unlike anything Elena had experienced during her months of visits. Extra guards patrolled the borders around the clock, strategic meetings stretched late into the evening hours, and Damien himself grew increasingly withdrawn, the weight of protecting his entire pack visibly settling more heavily onto his shoulders with each passing day. Elena continued running her diner during daylight hours, though she noticed additional guards now stationed discreetly nearby, blending into the ordinary rhythm of town life, while keeping careful watch over her safety. She tried to maintain normalcy for Kian's sake as much as her own, continuing their afternoon cooking sessions whenever his training schedule allowed, filling their time together with easy conversation that deliberately avoided the growing tension consuming the compound. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after Nora's urgent warning, Elena arrived at the compound to find the atmosphere charged with a different kind of energy entirely, something more immediate and dangerous than the watchful tension of previous days. Damien met her at the entrance, his expression grave. "Victor Ashwood has requested a formal meeting," he said without preamble. "He claims he wishes to negotiate a peaceful resolution to our border dispute. I intend to meet with him tomorrow." though I don't fully trust his intentions. Do you have to go alone? Elena asked, concern sharpening her voice. I'll bring Peter and several of my strongest guards, Damien assured her, though something in his tightly controlled expression suggested he was withholding some deeper worry from her. It's the only way to potentially avoid a conflict that would put everyone in this compound at risk, including you and Kian. Elena studied his face carefully, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. What aren't you telling me? Damien's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he seemed to war internally with how much to share. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of exhaustion Elena had rarely witnessed from him. Victor Ashwood has made it known, through certain channels, that he considers my son a significant weakness in our pack's defenses. A young heir, not yet capable of shifting, still vulnerable in ways that could be exploited. I fear this meeting may simply be a distraction, a way to draw my attention and my strongest guards away from the compound while he attempts something far more dangerous. Elena's blood ran cold at the implication. You think he might try to take Kian? I think it's a possibility I cannot afford to ignore, Damien admitted grimly, which is why I need you to stay close to him tomorrow, Elena. Nora and a select group of guards will remain behind to protect the compound, but Kian trusts you completely, and if anything unexpected happens, I need to know he has someone by his side who he'll listen to without hesitation. I won't leave his side, Elena promised immediately, determination steadying her voice despite the fear coiling through her chest. Whatever happens, I'll protect him with everything I have. Damien reached out, cupping her face gently in his hands, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that spoke of feelings too large and too frightening to fully voice, given the danger looming over them. I need you both safe, he murmured. More than anything else, more than any border dispute or pack politics, I need my family safe. We will be, Elena said, though the words felt more like a fervent hope than a guarantee, given the uncertainty hanging over the following day. Come back to us safely tomorrow, Damien. Kian and I will be waiting. He pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead before pulling back, his expression hardening once more into the resolute mask of leadership his position demanded. I intend to, he said firmly. Whatever Victor Ashwood truly wants from tomorrow's meeting, I intend to walk away from it with my pack's safety intact, and I intend to return to both of you, exactly as I am now. That night, Elena found little rest, her mind churning through worst-case scenarios despite her efforts to remain calm for Kian's sake. She sat with him for a while before he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, smoothing his hair back from his forehead the same way she imagined a mother might, her heart aching with fierce protectiveness for this boy who had first stumbled into her life as a hungry stranger, and had since become as precious to her as any child of her own blood could possibly be. As dawn broke over the compound the following morning, gray and heavy with tension, Elena watched Damien depart with Peter and 4 of his strongest guards, his expression carved from stone, betraying none of the vulnerability he had shown her the night before. She held Kian's hand tightly as they watched the group disappear into the tree line, both of them silently praying for a peaceful resolution neither fully believed was coming. The compound felt unnervingly quiet without Damien's commanding presence, the usual rhythm of daily activity, muted by the tension of his absence. Elena stayed close to Kian throughout the morning, keeping him occupied with lessons and small tasks, in an attempt to distract them both from constantly glancing toward the tree line where Damien and his group had disappeared hours before. Nora moved through the compound with sharp, watchful efficiency, checking in with the remaining guards at regular intervals, her expression betraying none of the worry Elena suspected she felt as well. Around midday, she approached Elena and Kian in the courtyard where they had been practicing simple reading exercises together. Any word from your father's group? Elena asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. Nothing yet, Nora admitted. The meeting location is nearly 2 hours away, near the old mill ruins that mark the boundary between our territories. It's still too early to expect news. Kian shifted anxiously beside Elena, his young face tight with worry he was clearly trying hard to suppress. What if something goes wrong? Your father is one of the most capable leaders in this entire region, Nora said firmly, kneeling to meet his eyes directly. He has survived far more dangerous situations than a tense negotiation. Trust in his strength, Kian, the same way he trusts in yours. Kian nodded, though the worry didn't fully leave his expression, and Elena squeezed his shoulder reassuringly, wishing she could offer more comfort than simple words allowed given her own mounting anxiety about the situation. They continued their lessons through the afternoon, though concentration proved increasingly difficult for all 3 of them as the hours stretched onward, without any word from Damien's group. As the sun began its slow descent toward evening, a commotion near the compound's main gate drew Elena's immediate attention. A guard came sprinting across the courtyard, his face pale with alarm. "Movement at the western perimeter," he reported to Nora breathlessly. "Multiple unidentified individuals approaching, moving fast." Nora's expression hardened instantly into sharp focus. "How many?" "At least 6, possibly more. They're not using the main paths." Elena's blood ran cold, understanding immediately the implication of this development. If Victor Ashwood had indeed used the negotiation meeting as a distraction, this approaching group could very well represent exactly the threat Damien had feared. "Get Kian to the safe room immediately," Nora commanded, already moving toward the perimeter with several nearby guards falling into formation around her. Elena grabbed Kian's hand without hesitation, pulling him toward the interior of the main hall, where a reinforced chamber had been prepared months earlier for exactly this kind of emergency. Her heart pounded furiously as they hurried through the corridors, Kian's small hand trembling within her firm grip. "Elena, I'm scared," he admitted, his voice small and frightened in a way that broke her heart even as adrenaline sharpened every one of her senses. "I know," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite her own racing pulse. "But we're going to be safe. I promise you. Whatever happens, I am not leaving your side." They reached the safe room, a small chamber hidden behind a section of wall that appeared, to any unfamiliar eye, like ordinary timber paneling. Elena guided Kian inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind them, and sliding the internal bolt into place with hands that shook only slightly. The chamber was dim, lit by a single small lantern, furnished simply with a bench and a few emergency supplies. Elena settled beside Kian on the bench, wrapping an arm around him as they sat in tense silence, straining to hear any sounds from beyond the thick walls that might indicate what was happening in the compound outside. Muffled shouts reached them faintly, followed by sounds that made Elena's stomach clench with dread. Sounds that might have been fighting, might have been the clash of bodies moving with inhuman speed and strength. Kian pressed closer against her side, his breathing rapid and shallow. "Is my father here?" he whispered. "Did he come back?" "I don't know," Elena admitted honestly, unwilling to lie to him even in this frightening moment. "But Nora and the guards are very capable, Kian. They've trained for exactly this kind of situation." The sounds outside continued for what felt like an eternity, though Elena knew realistically it was probably only minutes, each one stretching agonizingly as she strained to interpret meaning from the muffled chaos beyond their hiding place. Then, abruptly, the sounds shifted, growing louder, closer, and Elena's heart nearly stopped as she heard something heavy strike against the outer wall of the safe room itself. "They know we're in here," she realized with dawning horror, pulling Kian even tighter against her side. A voice called out from beyond the wall, muffled but clearly audible, cold and unfamiliar. "Open this door, and no harm will come to either of you. Refuse, and we will simply take longer to reach the same outcome, with considerably less patience remaining by the time we do." Elena's mind raced, terror and determination warring fiercely within her chest. She would not open that door, would not hand Kian over to whatever fate this cold voice intended. But she also had no illusions about how long a simple wooden panel could withstand a determined assault from whoever, or whatever, waited outside. "Kian," she whispered urgently, "is there another way out of this room? Any passage your father might have shown you?" Kian's eyes widened with sudden realization, and he nodded quickly, pointing toward a section of the floor near the back corner of the chamber. "There's a tunnel, for emergencies. Father showed me once but told me never to use it unless things were truly desperate." "I think this qualifies," Elena said grimly, already moving toward the indicated corner, running her fingers along the floorboards until she found a small recessed latch, nearly invisible in the dim lantern light. The panel lifted away to reveal a narrow passage descending into darkness, and Elena felt a fresh wave of fear at the thought of navigating an unknown tunnel with a frightened child in tow. But the alternative, remaining trapped in a room that intruders were actively trying to breach, felt infinitely more dangerous. "Down we go," she said, forcing confidence into her voice despite her racing heart, helping Kian into the passage before following closely behind him, pulling the panel closed above them, just as another heavy blow struck against the chamber door they had left behind. The tunnel was cramped and pitch black, forcing them to feel their way forward along cold earthen walls, Kian's small hand gripping Elena's tightly as they moved as quickly as caution allowed through the narrow passage. Elena had no clear idea where this tunnel might lead, only trusting that Damien's foresight in preparing such an escape route meant it would deliver them somewhere safer than the chamber they had just abandoned. Behind them, muffled through layers of earth and stone, Elena thought she heard the sound of the safe room door finally giving way, followed by voices raised in confusion at finding the chamber empty. She quickened her pace, pulling Kian along with renewed urgency, praying desperately that whatever lay at the end of this tunnel would offer the safety they so desperately needed. The tunnel finally sloped upward, and Elena felt cool evening air brush against her face as they approached what appeared to be the exit, a small opening concealed behind a thick curtain of ivy some distance beyond the compound's main walls. She pushed through the vines cautiously, scanning the surrounding darkness for any sign of danger before helping Kian climb out beside her. They emerged into a small clearing she didn't immediately recognize, the compound's walls visible through the trees some distance behind them, the sounds of continued commotion still faintly audible from that direction. Elena's relief at reaching open air was short-lived, however, as a rustling sound from the nearby underbrush sent her spinning around, pulling Kian protectively behind her. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their movements carrying that same unnatural, predatory grace Elena had come to associate with shifters, though these individuals radiated a coldness entirely different from the guards she had grown familiar with at the compound. The largest of them, a broad-shouldered man with sharp, calculating eyes, stepped forward with an unhurried confidence that made Elena's blood run cold. "Well," he said, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction that turned her stomach, "it seems the tunnel proved useful after all, just not quite in the way Damien intended." "Stay away from him," Elena said, forcing steel into her voice despite the fear clawing at her chest, positioning herself fully between Kian and these threatening strangers. The man's expression flickered with something almost like amusement. "Brave, for someone with no claws and no fangs to back up such demands. I am Victor Ashwood, and I have no particular quarrel with you, woman. Only with the boy standing behind you. Step aside, and you may yet walk away from this clearing unharmed." "Never," Elena said immediately, her arms tightening protectively around Kian, who trembled against her back but made no move to run, his young hands fisting into the fabric of her jacket. Victor's expression hardened, patience clearly thinning. "I had hoped to avoid unnecessary complications, but I suppose stubbornness runs deep in anyone Damien Cole chooses to keep close." He gestured sharply to his companions. "Take them both, then. The woman may prove a useful bargaining tool as well." The 2 flanking figures moved forward with frightening speed, and Elena barely had time to shove Kian behind a nearby tree trunk before rough hands seized her arms, pulling her away from him despite her fierce struggle. She twisted and fought with everything her ordinary human strength could muster, but against opponents possessing supernatural power, her efforts accomplished little beyond delaying the inevitable by mere seconds. "Run, Kian!" she shouted desperately, even as one of the men wrenched her arms behind her back, immobilizing her struggle entirely. But Kian, brave and loyal despite his young age, refused to abandon her, instead darting forward and sinking his teeth into the wrist of the guard restraining Elena with a ferocity that clearly startled the man, causing him to release his grip just long enough for Elena to stumble free. "Little Wolf has some bite in him after all," Victor observed with cold amusement, before nodding sharply to his remaining companion. The 3rd guard lunged for Kian, and this time there was no evading his grasp, strong arms closing around the boy despite his fierce, thrashing resistance. Elena screamed his name, throwing herself forward, only to be caught once again by the 1st guard, who this time secured his grip with unforgiving strength that left no room for escape. "Let him go," Elena cried, tears streaming down her face as Kian continued struggling futilely against the guard holding him captive. Victor Ashwood approached slowly, studying Kian's defiant, tear-streaked face with an expression of calculated interest. "Such spirit," he mused. "Your father's blood runs strong in you, boy. Perhaps that will prove useful, once he understands the price of continuing to defy my claims over the Eastern Territories. My father will destroy you for this," Kian spat, his young voice trembling with fear, but carrying an unmistakable fierceness that seemed to genuinely surprise Victor. "Perhaps," Victor allowed, his tone almost amused, "or perhaps he will finally understand the wisdom of ceding contested land peacefully, once he realizes exactly what continued resistance might cost him." He turned to his guards with a curt nod. "Bring them both. We move immediately, before Damien's search parties think to check this far from the compound." Elena continued struggling as she was forced into motion alongside Kian, her mind racing desperately for any option that might free them from this dangerous predicament. She caught Kian's eyes across the small distance between them, trying to convey silent reassurance despite the overwhelming fear coursing through her own chest, watching him draw visible strength from her steady gaze, even as tears continued streaming down his young face. They were marched deeper into unfamiliar forest, moving with the same unnatural speed Elena had witnessed from Damien's guards, the terrain blurring past far more quickly than her own labored breathing could keep pace with comfortably. She had no idea how long they traveled, nor in which direction, her sense of orientation completely lost within the confusing, shadowed depths of unfamiliar woodland. Eventually, they arrived at a smaller compound, considerably less impressive than Damien's own territory but clearly well established, hidden similarly deep within the forest's protective cover. Elena and Kian were separated immediately upon arrival. Despite Kian's fierce protests, Elena forced into a small, sparse chamber while Kian was led away toward a different section of the compound entirely. "Please," Elena begged as guards secured the heavy door of her makeshift cell. "Let me stay with him. He's just a child. He needs someone." Her pleas fell on deaf ears as the door swung shut, leaving her alone in the dim chamber, fear and desperate worry for Kian's safety consuming every fiber of her being. She sank onto the small cot provided, forcing herself to breathe steadily despite the panic threatening to overwhelm her, focusing every ounce of remaining strength on believing, fiercely and completely, that Damien would find them before Victor Ashwood's ambitions could cause any lasting harm to the boy they both loved so dearly. Damien returned to a compound in chaos, the acrid scent of struggle still hanging thick in the evening air, guards moving frantically between damaged structures, and Nora rushing toward him the moment his group crossed through the main gate, her face etched with a devastation that made his blood run instantly cold. "They took them," she said before he could even ask, her voice breaking with guilt and fear. "Ashwood's people breached the western perimeter while the negotiation meeting drew away our strongest guards. Elena managed to get Kian into the emergency tunnel, but they were caught in the clearing beyond it. I'm so sorry, Damien. We fought as hard as we could." "Both of them," Damien said, his voice deadly quiet in a way that made every guard nearby instinctively step back. "He took both of them." "Yes," Nora confirmed grimly. "We tracked their scent trail to the eastern boundary before it disappeared. They're likely holding them somewhere within Ashwood's own territory now." Something shifted behind Damien's eyes, a controlled fury so absolute that the surrounding air itself seemed to grow heavier with barely restrained power. Peter stepped forward cautiously, placing a steadying hand on his alpha's shoulder. "We will get them back," Peter said firmly, "but we need a strategy, not blind rage. Ashwood clearly wants something specific from this, likely the eastern territories he's been contesting. We can use that." Damien closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to breathe past the murderous instinct clawing at his chest, remembering with painful clarity the vow he had made to protect both his son and the woman who had become his heart's second home. "Gather every capable fighter within the hour," he said finally, his voice regaining its commanding steadiness despite the fury still simmering beneath the surface. "We move at first light, not before. I will not risk a reckless assault that endangers Elena and Kian further." The night that followed felt endless, Damien pacing the great hall while his most trusted advisors worked feverishly to gather intelligence on Ashwood's compound layout, likely guard positions, and any weaknesses that might be exploited during a rescue attempt. Damien himself contributed little to the strategic planning, his mind consumed instead with memories of Elena's warm laughter, Anne's delighted smile, images that fueled both his desperate fear and his unshakable determination in equal measure. As dawn finally broke, gray light seeping through the hall's tall windows, Damien gathered his assembled forces in the courtyard, addressing them with a controlled intensity that left no doubt about the seriousness of their mission. "We move quietly until we reach their perimeter," he instructed. "Once discovered, speed and precision matter more than raw strength. Our priority is locating Elena and Kian safely, not engaging Ashwood's forces directly unless absolutely necessary." "Am I understood?" A chorus of firm affirmations answered him, and Damien nodded once before leading his gathered pack toward the tree line, moving with a determined, silent efficiency that belied the fierce emotion churning beneath his composed exterior. They reached the boundary of Ashwood's territory as the sun climbed higher, and Damien paused briefly, closing his eyes to focus every sense on detecting any trace of familiar scent that might guide them toward his captured family. After several tense moments, his eyes snapped open with sudden recognition. "This way," he said urgently, already moving with renewed speed along a path only his heightened senses could detect. Meanwhile, within the confines of her small chamber, Elena had spent the night in restless, anxious wakefulness, straining constantly for any sound that might indicate Kian's well-being, in whatever section of this compound he had been taken to. As morning light finally filtered weakly through a small barred window, the door to her chamber opened, revealing Victor Ashwood himself, studying her with cold, assessing eyes. "Your alpha will arrive soon, I suspect," he said without preamble. "Perhaps within the hour, given how quickly news travels through forest territories. I wanted to speak with you before that confrontation occurs." "Where is Kian?" Elena demanded immediately, refusing to be distracted by whatever manipulation Victor intended. "Safe, for now," Victor said, his tone carrying an edge that made Elena's protective instincts flare fiercely despite her helpless position. His safety, however, depends entirely on how reasonably Damien chooses to negotiate once he arrives. "He'll never simply hand over territory because you've stooped to threatening a child," Elena said fiercely. "Whatever you think you're accomplishing here, you're only ensuring his absolute determination to see you defeated." Victor's expression flickered with something almost like respect, before hardening once more. We shall see how his determination holds when faced with the true cost of refusal. He turned to leave, pausing at the threshold. "I would advise cooperation. When the moment for negotiation arrives, it would be a shame for such loyalty to a child, not your own, to end in tragedy rather than triumph." The door closed behind him, and Elena sat alone once more, her heart pounding with fear for Kian's safety, and fierce determination that whatever happened in the coming hours, she would do everything within her power to ensure both of them emerged from this ordeal safely, alongside the man she had come to love with her whole heart. Outside, unbeknownst to either of them, Damien's forces were closing in with silent, deadly purpose. Guided by a father's unbreakable love and an alpha's fierce protective instinct, moving ever closer to the confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone caught within this dangerous web of territorial ambition and desperate love. A guard burst into Victor Ashwood's central hall, breathless with urgency. "Alpha, Damien Cole approaches the northern boundary with a full company of fighters. He requests immediate parley." Victor's jaw tightened, calculation flickering behind his eyes as he considered his options. "Bring him to the courtyard," he said finally, "alone. His fighters remain at the boundary, or this conversation ends before it begins." Word was relayed quickly, and within minutes, Damien strode into the courtyard alone, his expression a mask of controlled fury that nonetheless radiated barely restrained danger with every measured step. Victor met him there, flanked by several of his own guards, though he raised a hand to keep them at a respectful distance as the two alphas faced each other directly. "You have my son," Damien said, his voice low and deadly calm despite the storm clearly raging beneath the surface. "And a woman under my protection. Release them both, unharmed, immediately." "Such demands, from a man with no fighters currently standing beside him," Victor observed coolly. "Perhaps we should discuss the Eastern Territories first, given how much leverage this situation currently provides me." "There will be no negotiation over stolen territory achieved through the kidnapping of a child," Damien said, his voice hardening further. "Release them now, and I will consider allowing you to walk away from this courtyard breathing. Continue this foolishness, and you will discover exactly how far my restraint currently extends." Victor's confident expression flickered slightly at the absolute conviction in Damien's tone, though he attempted to maintain his composure. "Bold words. For someone whose forces remain conveniently distant. My forces are not the threat you should currently be concerned with," Damien said, and something shifted behind his eyes, a barely contained power that made even Victor's own guards shift uneasily. "I am." Before Victor could respond, a commotion erupted from within the compound's interior structures, shouts of alarm rising suddenly into the tense morning air. Victor's head snapped toward the sound, confusion and alarm crossing his features as one of his own guards came sprinting toward them. "Alpha, the boy," the guard gasped. "He's escaped his chamber, we don't know how, and the woman's cell shows signs of forced entry." Damien's expression transformed instantly from controlled fury into fierce, focused determination, and before Victor could react, he moved with a speed that seemed to blur the space between them, closing the distance and seizing Victor by the collar, with a grip that left absolutely no room for resistance. "If either of them has been harmed," Damien growled, his voice carrying an authority that made every guard present freeze in place, "there will be nothing left of your pack by nightfall." "I have not harmed them," Victor said quickly, genuine alarm now evident beneath his composed exterior. "I don't know how the boy escaped his chamber, I assure you." A shout from across the courtyard interrupted him, and both alphas turned sharply to see Kian sprinting toward them, having somehow slipped free from whatever restraints had been holding him, with Elena close behind, having clearly worked together to secure their own escape from separate chambers within the chaos of the compound. "Father," Kian cried, and Damien released Victor immediately, catching his son in a fierce embrace, as Elena arrived moments later, breathless but unharmed, relief flooding her features at the sight of Damien standing safely before her. "You're both safe," Damien breathed, pulling Elena into the embrace alongside Kian, holding them both with a desperate tenderness that spoke volumes about the fear he had carried throughout the tense negotiations. "Thank every star in the sky, you're both safe." Kian figured out how to pick the lock on his chamber, Elena explained quickly, still catching her breath. He came for me the moment he was free, and we managed to slip past the guards during the confusion of your arrival. Damien looked down at his son with an expression of overwhelming pride and love, ruffling his hair affectionately despite the seriousness of the situation still surrounding them. Resourceful, brave, and completely unwilling to leave without the woman who taught him what real courage looks like. You continue to amaze me, Kian. Victor Ashwood, watching this reunion unfold, seemed to finally grasp the true weight of what he had risked in this reckless gambit, his expression shifting from calculated ambition into genuine unease as he observed the fierce, protective love binding this small family together so completely. This ends now, Damien said, turning back toward Victor with renewed authority, though the murderous edge had softened slightly now that his family stood safely beside him. You will withdraw any claims over the Eastern Territories permanently, and you will never again threaten anyone under my protection. In exchange, I will allow you and your pack to continue existing peacefully within your current boundaries. This is not a negotiation, Victor. This is your only remaining option. Victor, faced with the overwhelming reality of his failed scheme, and the fierce alpha standing before him, nodded stiffly, clearly recognizing that further resistance would only invite consequences far worse than simply ceding his ambitious territorial claims. Agreed, he said tightly. The Eastern Territories remain yours. This conflict ends here. With the matter settled, Damien gathered his small family close, guiding them swiftly back toward his waiting fighters at the boundary, leaving Victor Ashwood's compound behind with a sense of profound relief washing over all three of them. The journey home felt different from any previous walk through these familiar woods, lighter somehow, despite the exhaustion and lingering fear still clinging to each of them. Kian walked between Elena and Damien, holding a hand from each of them, occasionally glancing up at their faces as though reassuring himself that this safety was truly real, and not simply another anxious dream. When they finally arrived back at their own compound, greeted by relieved cheers from the gathered pack members who had awaited news of their fate with anxious hope, Damien pulled both Elena and Kian into a private moment away from the celebrating crowd, his expression solemn with newfound clarity. I nearly lost everything that matters most to me yesterday, he said quietly, looking between them both, and it has shown me, with painful clarity, exactly what I want my life to look like moving forward. He turned to Elena, taking her hands gently in his own. I love you, completely and without reservation. I want you beside me, not simply as Kian's caretaker, but as my partner in every sense of that word, for the rest of my life. Will you accept me, Elena Marsh, as your mate and your husband, and join our family permanently? Tears welled in Elena's eyes as she looked between Damien's hopeful expression and Kian's equally hopeful, bright-eyed anticipation, remembering the long journey that had brought them here, beginning with nothing more than a simple bowl of stew offered to a hungry, frightened boy on a rainy night many months before. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I accept, completely and joyfully. Kian let out an enthusiastic whoop of celebration, throwing his arms around both of them at once, and the surrounding pack members, catching sight of this joyful moment, erupted into cheers and applause that echoed warmly across the courtyard. In the months that followed, Elena's diner continued operating successfully in town, now often filled with pack members who had grown fond of her cooking during the difficult months of conflict, while her life at the compound blossomed into something rich and deeply fulfilling alongside Damien and Kian. The small boy who had once stood alone in the rain, hungry and frightened, had found not just a meal that first night, but an entirely new family built on kindness, courage, and a love that had proven strong enough to weather even the most dangerous of storms. And every evening, as the sun set gently over Ashford Hollow, the porch light of Elena's diner continued burning bright, no longer a beacon for a lonely, hungry boy hiding in darkness, but a warm symbol of the family they had built together, a family bound not by blood alone, but by the simplest, most powerful kindness one stranger had chosen to offer another, on an ordinary rainy night, that had changed everything.